They found Gary Ferris in the fire pit, or at least what was left of him. By the time investigators arrived at the rural property in Cherokee County, Georgia, all that remained was ash, charred debris, and a few fragments of bone, scattered among the cinders like the remnants of a forgotten ritual. His body had been burned so thoroughly that it took a forensic team days to confirm what the crime scene had tried to erase. Gary wasn't supposed to disappear. He wasn't the kind of man who vanished quietly. He was a seasoned attorney, known in his community for his methodical nature, his strict adherence to routine, and his sharp instincts both inside and outside the courtroom. For over 20 years, he'd handled high-stakes disputes, written ironclad contracts, and carved out a reputation as a man who left nothing to chance. And yet somehow, he had disappeared, without warning, without explanation, and, as it would turn out, without a single call for help from his own home. In the days before the discovery, his absence had seemed more odd than urgent. He'd missed a court appointment, something he never did. Colleagues tried calling. His assistant sent emails. Nothing. A friend drove out to check on him and found his car still parked outside, the front door locked, the house still and quiet. Gary's personal belongings, his keys, his wallet, his phone, were all inside. But Gary wasn't. His wife, Melody Ferris, was home. She told the friend Gary had gone somewhere and that she didn't know when he'd be back. There was no concern in her voice, no mention of calling the police, no suggestion that anything was wrong, just a vague explanation and the sound of the screen door clicking shut. Still, something felt off. A neighbor later recalled seeing thick smoke rising from the Ferris property earlier that week. He thought it was strange, too much for a brush pile, too dark for a routine fire. But in a place where people often burned yard waste, no one called it in. Only later, after the welfare check turned into a crime scene investigation, did that smoke take on a different meaning. Behind the house, investigators found the fire pit. It was large, roughly 6 feet across, ringed with stones and filled with compacted ash. At first glance, it looked like any number of backyard burn piles in rural America. But beneath the charred surface, forensic experts found something unexpected: bone fragments, cracked by intense heat. Some were identifiable. Others had melted beyond recognition. One piece in particular caught their attention: a section of rib bone, blackened, warped, and embedded with a small copper-jacketed bullet. It was enough to confirm two things: someone had died here, and that death was not accidental. Gary Ferris was now the subject of a homicide investigation. What made the case even more disturbing was the time it took to realize he was missing at all. No 911 call, no missing persons report, no urgency from anyone inside the home. Days had passed between his death and the first signs of alarm. And in that time, someone had tried to erase every trace of him. All of it pointed back to one person. Melody Ferris didn't run. She didn't protest the search. She didn't offer any real explanation. When questioned, she remained calm, reserved, and oddly composed. She didn't ask where the investigation was going. She didn't ask about Gary. She didn't ask anything at all. For seasoned investigators, that was its own kind of answer. What happened to Gary Ferris was not a crime of opportunity. It wasn't a moment of rage or an act of impulse. It was something colder, more calculated. Someone had taken the time to stage a disappearance, destroy the body, and wait in silence, as if nothing had happened. The question was no longer if a crime had occurred. It was how long it had been planned, and who exactly had the most to gain. When law enforcement returned to the Ferris property after the discovery of human remains in the fire pit, they weren't looking for speculation anymore. They were looking for answers. A welfare check had quickly escalated into a crime scene, and every detail from that point forward would be scrutinized under the lens of a homicide investigation. But at the center of it all stood one figure: Melody Ferris. In many true crime stories, it's the absence of emotion that leaves a mark. Not the screams, not the panic, but the unsettling calm. And from the first encounter, Melody's demeanor raised quiet alarms. She didn't cry. She didn't ask where her husband's body had been found. She offered no insight, no confusion, no denial. She simply stood there, offering little more than nods and one-word answers. Investigators took note. The silence wasn't just a lack of cooperation. It felt like an absence of concern. Gary's sudden disappearance, and now confirmed death, should have generated a flood of emotional upheaval. Yet within the home they had once shared, there were no visible signs of mourning, no disheveled rooms, No late-night phone calls to friends, no frantic attempts to post online inquiries or file a missing persons report. It was as if she had quietly accepted something long before the outside world was even aware of it. The Ferris home itself mirrored that stillness. It was neat. The kitchen was clean. The bedroom made up. Even Gary's belongings appeared untouched. His shoes still aligned by the door, his laptop resting on the desk, his planner open to a week filled with now-missed appointments. The normalcy of it all was what made it most disturbing. No break-in, no forced entry, no struggle. Just an eerie preservation of routine, as if nothing had happened at all. Detectives combed through the house methodically. They weren't expecting gore or overt signs of violence, not after the nature of the disposal, but they were hoping for something: fibers, traces of blood, disturbed furniture, cleaning products out of place. What they found instead were subtle discrepancies. The garbage bin outside had been emptied, its liner replaced too cleanly. The washing machine had just finished a cycle, only a single towel inside. A faint chemical smell lingered in the utility room, like bleach diluted and evaporated. The house had been maintained, not just lived in. Neighbors were questioned next. Most described the couple as private but polite. Melody wasn't overly social but exchanged pleasantries. Gary was known more broadly. He handled local legal matters, estate planning, even the occasional dispute resolution. He was respected, maybe even feared a little. Melody, by contrast, existed in the background. To some, she came across as soft-spoken and passive, to others guarded. But almost no one recalled the two ever showing signs of trouble. No loud arguments, no sudden absences, no obvious red flags. One neighbor, however, remembered something else: a burn. Not a fire, but a smell. Days before the body was discovered, thick smoke had drifted through the tree line into their yard. Acrid, chemical. It lingered for hours. The fire itself wasn't visible from their house, but the smell had been sharp enough to close the windows. At the time, they assumed it was garbage or brush, nothing more. Now, that detail felt different. Back at the sheriff's office, the pressure began to mount. A search warrant was extended to include Melody's phone, computer, and digital communications. They began reconstructing a timeline: when Gary was last seen, when he last communicated, when Melody claimed he left, and what gaps remained in between. What emerged was a troubling silence. Gary's phone had gone dark abruptly. His last known communication was with a colleague via text, short, clipped, and ending mid-conversation. Melody's phone showed no outgoing calls to friends or family after his disappearance. There were no attempts to file a missing persons report, no signs that she had looked for him at all. From a behavioral analysis standpoint, this was critical. In cases of intimate partner homicide, a common thread is the narrative management that follows. People who are innocent tend to panic. They reach out. They demand help. They ask questions, sometimes frantically, sometimes irrationally, but they respond. Silence, by contrast, can signal foreknowledge, not always guilt, but knowledge. And knowledge ahead of discovery often separates witnesses from suspects. When confronted with the results of the forensic report, when told that Gary's remains had been found and that a bullet had been recovered from the fragments, Melody gave no immediate reaction. Her face didn't flinch. Her voice didn't rise. She simply said, "I don't know anything about that." To investigators, it was as if she had emotionally stepped away from the situation long before anyone else knew it existed. Still, at this stage in the investigation, the department had no direct evidence tying her to the killing. Suspicion, yes. Behavioral anomalies, yes, but no confession. No eyewitness. No clear motive backed by documented threats or financial gain. They couldn't arrest her, yet. What they needed was a deeper look into Gary's life, a reason why someone would want him dead, and whether anyone else might have been involved. What they had was a burned body, a controlled crime scene, a cold reaction, and a marriage that, on the surface, had shown no cracks. But appearances in criminal investigations are often the first illusions to fall apart. And the quiet woman at the center of it all, whether guilty or not, was holding on to something tightly, something she wasn't ready to share. Behind the stillness of her demeanor, there were choices. Calculated or not, passive or active, they would matter. And if Gary Ferris was a man who built a life on details, then it would be the details, hidden in ash, data, memory, and behavior, that would eventually speak for him. The science of fire rarely leaves behind anything generous. In a typical house fire, temperatures reach over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to weaken steel, reduce wood to ash, and erase most organic tissue within minutes. In a controlled backyard burn, like the one discovered behind the Ferris residence, the destructive precision can be even more effective. Unlike spontaneous fires, these burns are curated, stoked, managed, watched. That distinction matters, because what was uncovered in the ashes wasn't an accident. It was an attempt to remove a person from the world entirely. As forensic teams descended on the scene, the fire pit became the focal point. Roughly 6 feet in diameter and ringed with stone, it appeared at first to be a common rural feature, used for bonfires or clearing brush. But within its center was a dense layer of ash far darker than organic debris would produce alone. Mixed into the base were unrecognizable lumps of partially fused material, bits of metal, bone, and something else entirely, remnants of synthetic fabric that had melted into the soil. The fire had burned hot, sustained, and according to fire pattern analysts, it had likely been tended to over the course of hours, possibly in phases. The human body does not disappear easily. Even in fire, there are parts that resist. Teeth, bone, and metal survive long after soft tissue is consumed. That's why forensic anthropologists are often called in for cases like this, not to identify remains by their appearance, but by their architecture. Within the fragments recovered, a pattern began to form: pelvic bone, partial vertebrae, segments of rib. The density and shape were consistent with an adult male, and it wasn't just the remains. They were found aligned, centered within the pit, as if the body had been intentionally placed. Most damning of all was a specific bone, curved, cracked from extreme heat, but unmistakably a rib. Embedded within it, fused to its interior structure, was a small metallic fragment. Ballistics would later confirm it was a .38 caliber round, fired at close range and lodged deep in the bone. It had survived not just the gunshot, but the fire itself. Now the case was no longer about suspicion, it was about confirmation. While forensic specialists processed the remains, other investigators turned to the surrounding area. Burn patterns extended beyond the pit, indicating someone had moved the fire's location at least once, perhaps in an attempt to obscure heat signatures or complicate the reconstruction. A nearby garden hose was partially uncoiled, suggesting control over the flames had been maintained deliberately. No accelerants were found, but layers of compacted ash indicated that wood or similar materials had been added gradually, feeding the burn like fuel to a furnace. It wasn't a rush job. It had taken time, and whoever was responsible had stood there, watched it, ensuring the job was complete. In the garage, a shovel was recovered. Clean, too clean. It had been scrubbed, but small traces of carbon residue and organic matter remained in the crevices. Analysts believed it had been used either to stoke the fire or to reposition the remains. Soil samples beneath the fire pit showed signs of saturation, water mixed with fine ash, suggesting the fire had been doused at intervals to control its intensity and prolong the smoldering effect. At the lab, DNA testing began. Though heat had degraded most cellular material, mitochondrial DNA was still recoverable from bone marrow deep within the larger fragments. The result was definitive. The remains were those of Gary Ferris. That fact, in isolation, might not seem extraordinary. After all, his car was at the house, his personal effects untouched. But the discovery of the bullet transformed the nature of the case. This wasn't just a death. It was a murder, carried out with precision, followed by an attempt to eliminate the evidence with equal calculation. Beyond the science, though, what lingered was the question of motive, and more importantly, timing. Investigators began tracing Gary's final movements. His last known communication was a text message to a colleague sent on the evening he disappeared. It read, "Need to reschedule, something came up at home." No follow-up, no response. The colleague had replied an hour later. It was never read. A neighbor's security camera captured footage that same night. Though grainy, it showed a figure in the backyard of the Ferris property, dragging what appeared to be a large tarp or sheet toward the fire pit. The footage was time-stamped hours after sunset. No lights were on in the house, just the slow, deliberate movement of someone working in near darkness. It wasn't possible to identify the figure, not from that angle. But the movements were calm, not hurried, not panicked. If Gary had been killed inside the home, as some investigators suspected, it was done cleanly. There was no visible blood, no disrupted furniture, no defensive wounds on the remains that could be identified. That pointed to one of two things, either an ambush or a victim who never saw the attack coming. Forensic luminol testing was performed throughout the house. In the garage, faint traces of blood reacted near a workbench and across part of the concrete floor, too little for a struggle but enough to confirm that blood had been there and had been wiped away. Chemical compounds used to clean surfaces were found in higher-than-average concentrations in several areas of the garage and mudroom. Piece by piece, the picture was forming. Gary Ferris had been shot, his body moved, burned, possibly dismembered to hasten decomposition and obscure the bullet wound. The crime scene was controlled, the burn, intentional, the cleanup, methodical. The act itself, whether in a moment of rage or as part of a longer plan, had required proximity, time, and silence. But as any seasoned investigator will confirm, silence rarely holds. Back at the sheriff's office, attention now shifted to the person with access to all of those things. The one who lived on the property, the one who had not reported Gary missing, the one who had given no alibi, and the one whose responses remained chillingly indifferent. Still, law enforcement had no confession, no eyewitness, no direct evidence of the moment of death. What they had was the outcome, a man erased with surgical precision and a fire that had tried and failed to make him disappear. And that failure would be what cracked the case open. Long before the smoke, before the silence, before the remains were sifted from ash and bone, the story of Gary and Melody Ferris was already unraveling. Only no one had looked closely enough to see it. To the outside world, theirs was a familiar Southern narrative, a respected attorney and his quiet wife living on a modest rural property, away from the noise and pace of the city. They were not the kind of couple people whispered about. They blended in, said the right things at community events, kept their yard in good order. But as investigators began to trace the months leading up to Gary's death, a very different portrait began to emerge, one shaped not by conflict, but by slow erosion. Gary was by all accounts a man of precision. He built his law practice on structure, contracts were tight, schedules were fixed, and he expected the same from those around him. He wasn't unkind, but he was exacting. Colleagues described him as intensely organized, private, and cautious with his trust. He avoided risk, he didn't socialize often, and in the courtroom he was methodical to the point of intimidation. Those traits, which had earned him respect in his professional life, carried over into his personal life in ways that weren't always easy to live with. Melody, by contrast, had come from less stability. Her early adult years had been marked by economic uncertainty and a difficult divorce. She married Gary later in life, bringing with her a son from a previous relationship and what friends described as a deep longing for security. That longing, some would later suggest, became dependence. She didn't work outside the home. Gary controlled most financial matters. He paid the bills, oversaw the accounts, and managed their property as if it were part of a ledger sheet. According to records, Melody's name was not on any of the investment portfolios, and only on the house by shared default. In the eyes of the law, she had access, but not control. And control, in relationships built on imbalance, becomes its own kind of currency. As investigators reviewed digital records, they discovered that, in the weeks before Gary's disappearance, Melody had conducted several quiet online searches. Not sensational ones. Nothing about murder, no guides to forensics or body disposal. What she had searched were things like spousal inheritance rules and what happens if my husband dies without a will. Subtle, legalistic, but notable. They also uncovered a string of messages between Melody and a long-distance friend, in which she expressed growing frustration. The messages were veiled, not confessions, but layered with exhaustion. She wrote about feeling watched all the time, about never having a say, and about wishing she could just start over. They were not direct threats, but they revealed a woman quietly suffocating, not in an abusive relationship per se, but in one where she felt invisible. And invisibility, when sustained over time, does something to a person. It distorts the lines between justification and consequence. Gary, for his part, may not have seen it coming. He likely viewed their arrangement as functional, efficient. He paid the bills. Melody kept the house. And while that structure may have worked for a time, it left little room for either of them to voice dissatisfaction. There were no reported arguments, no police calls, no physical violence. But absence of conflict is not the same as peace. Sometimes the worst fractures are the quiet ones, those that spread beneath the surface until they compromise the entire foundation. A former neighbor, interviewed during the investigation, recalled an odd exchange a few weeks prior. Gary had mentioned reviewing some things in case he needed to update his estate. He said it offhandedly while discussing retirement plans. but he also remarked that he'd have to make sure everything was buttoned up if something ever happened. The neighbor didn't press, assuming it was typical estate talk. But investigators took note, particularly since no updated will was ever located. In addition to the financial threads, a deeper dive into Melody's communications uncovered a more personal dynamic. She had reconnected with an old acquaintance through social media months earlier. The tone of their messages was emotional, even intimate in places, though not explicitly romantic. Still, it added a new layer. Melody, who lived with so little agency, had found someone to talk to, someone who responded, someone who wasn't Gary. Investigators now had multiple prongs, a motive rooted in control, a potential shift in emotional allegiance, and a mounting body of circumstantial evidence. No direct proof of intent yet, no smoking gun. But the outline was becoming clearer. And then came the financial review. Gary's accounts showed several recent changes. A large transfer had been initiated but never completed. It was scheduled for the week after he vanished. The destination? A trust account that listed Melody as the sole beneficiary. There was no documentation indicating why the transfer had been planned. No emails, no shared notes, just a pending action that died when he did. The timing was uncomfortable. It raised the question of whether Gary had been making financial preparations voluntarily, or whether someone else had started the process on his behalf. Investigators traced the IP address associated with the scheduled transfer. It came from the Ferris home, specifically from Gary's office computer. But the login pattern, password behavior, and timestamps suggested the user may not have been Gary. Forensic analysis on the keyboard revealed partial fingerprints, smudged but recoverable. 2 were confirmed as Melody's. This wasn't conclusive, but it was deeply suspicious. If Gary hadn't initiated the transfer himself, someone had gone through significant effort to make it look like he had. At this point in the case, law enforcement began to move from a narrative of disappearance and death to one of premeditated manipulation. If this was a crime of passion, it had been carefully disguised. If it was financially motivated, it had been rehearsed. And if it was neither, then the motive lay somewhere more complex, perhaps emotional, psychological, built up over years in a household where roles had become cages. Whatever the motive, one thing was becoming certain. Gary had not simply been the victim of circumstance. His death was not collateral damage from a spontaneous decision. It had been orchestrated in silence, and its cover-up managed with chilling precision. That precision was starting to crack. By the 5th week of the investigation, silence had become its own kind of evidence. Melody Ferris had not changed her story. She had not offered a revised timeline, no new explanation for Gary's disappearance, no reaction to the forensic results that had confirmed the presence of his remains in the backyard fire pit. Her position remained stark and consistent. She did not know where Gary had gone, she had nothing to do with his death, and she had no comment on the events that had turned their property into a crime scene. But law enforcement understood that silence isn't neutral. When spoken through the lens of legal counsel or emotional trauma, it can be strategic. But when it is uninterrupted, unbroken, and sustained through mounting evidence, it begins to shape the story in ways that facts alone cannot. And in this case, the silence was growing heavier by the day. At the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office, the investigative team had begun dissecting the timeline, not just to document Melody's actions, but to test them. The digital trail was extensive. Every modern investigation is as much about devices as it is about doors. Gary's phone, Melody's tablet, the router logs from their home Wi-Fi network, even the GPS metadata from smart appliances in their house, all were under review. From those sources, a digital map was drawn. It showed when lights were turned on and off, when Gary's cell phone disconnected from the network, when emails stopped being checked, when doors opened and closed according to timestamps from their smart security system. It was a quiet blueprint of the hours surrounding Gary's disappearance, and it betrayed no signs of outside intrusion. The crucial window, between the evening Gary sent his final text and the time the fire was first observed, was narrow. It left almost no opportunity for a third party to enter the home unnoticed, carry out a murder, transport a body, and initiate a fire sophisticated enough to destroy nearly every trace. Which meant that if this was a homicide by someone other than Melody, it had been executed with perfect stealth, in a home equipped with passive surveillance and left no forensic footprint. Investigators found that scenario implausible. Attention then shifted to Melody's actions during those key hours. While her phone was largely inactive, surveillance data from a nearby traffic camera placed her vehicle on the main road at 3:17 a.m., moving away from the residence before looping back roughly 20 minutes later. When asked about that trip, she had no explanation. She claimed she couldn't remember leaving the house that night. The location she had passed was in the opposite direction of any open business or hospital. The investigators noted the time, the route, and the oddity of traveling at that hour, with no apparent purpose and no one else awake to corroborate her statement. This inconsistency led to the decision to interview Melody's adult son, Scott Ferris. He did not live at the residence but had grown up partially in Gary's household. His relationship with Gary was respectful, though not particularly close. When questioned, Scott revealed that his mother had seemed strange in the days following Gary's disappearance. Not visibly shaken, but disconnected, detached. She told him not to come by the house, said she was dealing with a lot. What struck him most was that she never asked for help, not to find Gary, not to understand what might have happened, not even for emotional support. It was as if she had already resigned herself to his absence. Scott's interview opened a new door. Investigators discovered that he had once overheard a tense conversation between Melody and Gary about money. He didn't know the details, but remembered Gary insisting that something wasn't going to happen. The conversation ended abruptly, and neither of them spoke of it again, but the memory lingered. It led the team to search deeper into financial discrepancies. That's when they found something new, a digital invoice for a cleanup service, never completed, never paid, but requested through an anonymous email tied back to the Ferris IP address. The inquiry had been made only 3 days before Gary's final text message. The company, which specialized in estate cleanouts and hoarding remediation, had no idea who had contacted them, but the timing was impossible to ignore. Alongside this, data recovered from a deleted folder on Melody's tablet revealed a draft email to a local attorney. It was never sent. The subject line read, "Power of Attorney." The body of the message was brief. "If something happens to Gary, I need to understand how assets will be transferred." Investigators recovered metadata showing it was written, saved, and deleted 2 days before Gary vanished. Though none of these findings were definitive on their own, the picture they painted was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. Taken together, they suggested foresight, preparation, and knowledge, long before the physical crime had taken place. They suggested someone who had begun to plan for a life without Gary, not in mourning, but in transition. Despite mounting suspicion, Melody still had not been charged. The district attorney's office was cautious. Homicide cases built on circumstantial evidence, no confession, no eyewitness, no weapon recovered, required an airtight narrative. But each new inconsistency deepened the cracks in Melody's version of events. As the investigation expanded, so did public awareness. The local media began picking up the story, reporting cautiously at first, missing person turned homicide, no arrests made. But the whispers in the community had grown louder. Some defended Melody, pointing to her quiet nature and the lack of direct proof. Others were convinced she was hiding something. What united both sides was a shared disbelief that something so chilling had unfolded in such plain sight. Among the investigators, the focus shifted from asking if Melody was involved to asking how. What was the sequence? Where was the gun? Who else might have known? Was this the work of one person acting alone, or the final act in a chain of psychological decline? The answers were still out of reach, but the direction was clear. And through it all, Melody remained unchanged. She did not ask what had been found. She did not inquire about Gary's remains. She did not reach out to anyone outside her attorney. Her silence, at first a mystery, had become her defining trait. But silence, as every investigator learns, is never empty. It carries weight. It reveals more than it conceals. And in this case, it was slowly turning into the loudest sound of all. By the time the forensic evidence returned from the state crime lab, the investigation had shifted from a hunt for clarity to a pursuit of precision. What began as a suspicious disappearance had evolved into a fully recognized homicide, and now, the weight of physical proof was beginning to tip the scale of justice. Behind closed doors, the Cherokee County District Attorney's Office began drafting an internal outline of a prosecutorial strategy, one grounded not in confession, but in the methodical layering of circumstantial truth. The breakthrough came not with a revelation, but with a fragment, small, burned, nearly discarded. Amid the bone fragments recovered from the backyard fire pit, crime scene analysts had preserved a charred, partially intact segment of textile, fibrous, blackened, and fused with traces of melted synthetic resin. When tested, it revealed a polyblend common in men's casual dress shirts. Embedded within its weave were minute flecks of bone ash, traces of iron, and something else, a droplet of dried blood preserved in a pocket of heat-shielded fabric. The sample was degraded but viable. DNA analysis confirmed it belonged to Gary Ferris. That single thread of evidence provided what the case had so far lacked, a direct connection between the fire and the act of violence itself, not just disposal, not an afterthought. A trace of blood meant the fire was not simply post-mortem. It may have been an active stage in the commission or concealment of the killing. Simultaneously, a parallel forensic review of the garage uncovered residues of vaporized lead, consistent with gunshot discharge. These trace particulates had embedded in the concrete floor near the workbench and had not been fully washed away, even under intense scrubbing. Infrared spectrometry, along with laser ablation testing, isolated chemical signatures confirming the presence of both lead styphnate and barium nitrate, compounds found in most .38 caliber cartridges. The presence of these residues offered silent testimony. A weapon had been discharged within that space. Even without the firearm itself, this was significant. Gunshot residue is transient. It doesn't linger on surfaces for long unless it's undisturbed. Its presence, weeks later, implied the shooting had taken place there, likely within close proximity to the final resting place of Gary's body. Layered onto the already damning timeline, the evidence became more difficult to interpret as anything but intentional. Gary was last active on his devices early that evening. Melody claimed no knowledge of his whereabouts. Her own device went dark for hours, only to reconnect to their home network at irregular intervals. During those hours, the fire had started. Her vehicle had left and returned under the cover of night. Her financial activity had increased. Her communication with friends had vanished. Now, the forensic indicators pointed squarely at the garage, a controlled environment with no signs of forced entry and no evidence of outside interference. Blood, gunshot residue, a body burned, and a household where only one other person had opportunity, access, and motive. It was at this stage that investigators re-reviewed early witness statements, searching not for what was said, but for what might have been missed. One such re-examination came from a local delivery driver who had passed the Ferris property multiple times during his route in the weeks before the crime. On one occasion, just days before Gary's disappearance, he recalled Melody standing alone behind the garage, pulling a large blue tarp across the yard. She wasn't struggling with it, but she appeared focused. The driver didn't stop to ask what she was doing. At the time, he assumed it was yard work or perhaps storm prep. But that tarp would become a chilling symbol when investigators discovered pieces of melted plastic embedded in the soil near the fire pit, plastic that matched the color and density of common utility tarps. Every small inconsistency now demanded context. Melody's lack of injury despite what would have been significant manual labor, her emotionless tone during interviews, the absence of grief expressed publicly or even privately through digital messages. In an ordinary case, these might be anecdotal, subjective at best. But in a case so absent of alternative suspects, the subtle misalignments began to form the spine of a larger structure. Human behavior, when examined through a forensic lens, reveals patterns, not only in what is done, but in what is avoided. When tragedy strikes, people act. They reach out, grasp for help, ask questions. But in this case, Melody had remained frozen, disengaged, untouched by the gravity of what surrounded her. And now, with each new layer of physical evidence, it was no longer enough to explain her silence as shock. One of the most haunting aspects of the investigation came during a later stage of the scene analysis. Beneath the top layer of ash in the fire pit, investigators found fused metal fragments, difficult to distinguish at first, until one forensic technician recognized the charred imprint of a belt buckle. The item, once cleaned, was confirmed by family as belonging to Gary. It had been a gift from his father, a small personal detail that offered no forensic value, but carried immense symbolic weight. Sometimes, what endures through fire is not the body, but what the person once carried. And it is those fragments, not just of bone, but of life, that often speak loudest in the courtroom. The DA's team now began assembling the core of their case. While no single element was definitive, the cumulative weight had become overwhelming. Digital footprints, forensic residues, motive outlined through financial data, behavioral anomalies, and now physical evidence tying Gary's possessions directly to the scene of his death. What remained was the question of timing. How long had the plan been in motion? Was it a singular moment of emotional collapse, or a slowly evolving decision made over weeks, perhaps months? To answer that, investigators turned once more to the devices. Deep in the metadata of Melody's tablet, forensic IT analysts discovered deleted browser histories, retrieved through system-level logs not easily erased. In addition to the legal inheritance searches already known, the records revealed several late-night visits to forums discussing death certificates, how long it took for remains to be identified by dental records, and most chilling of all, questions about the typical time frame for forensic labs to analyze bone. The searches were spread out, unlinked, but they painted a psychological map of someone anticipating the aftermath of death, not merely reacting to it. From a criminal behavioral standpoint, this provided the final pivot. Prosecutors were no longer preparing for a reactive trial. They were preparing for a calculated murder case, one rooted in intent, cloaked in silence, and carried out with a chilling detachment. After months of steady accumulation of ash, data, fragments, and motive, the case was approaching its inflection point. Investigators had built a scaffold of circumstantial evidence, strong enough to withstand scrutiny but still lacking one critical pillar, a direct witness. No confession, no video, no weapon, just the cold, measured accumulation of indicators, all pointing in one direction. But then, in a move no one predicted, the silence cracked. It came during a routine interview follow-up. Scott Ferris, Melody's adult son, had already given a statement earlier in the investigation offering only vague impressions. His mother had seemed distant, withdrawn, and unwilling to discuss Gary's sudden disappearance. At the time, it had registered as odd, but not incriminating. Now, months later, Scott reached out to the lead detective with a change of tone. There was something he hadn't disclosed, not because he had intended to withhold it, but because at the time it hadn't made sense. In light of everything that had unfolded, it now felt urgent. He recalled a conversation, brief, unsettling, and spoken in a low, flat voice. A few days after Gary vanished, Melody had told him not to come over. When he asked why, she paused. Then, without meeting his eye, she said, "It's done. There's nothing to fix now. Just don't make it worse." Scott hadn't known what to make of it. He assumed she meant something financial, perhaps a failed investment, or that Gary had finally left her. But now, with what the news had reported, with what law enforcement had uncovered, the meaning of her words shifted into focus. That statement, "It's done. There's nothing to fix," became a turning point. Prosecutors recognized what they had, a statement against interest, a form of near admission. Not a confession in legal terms, but something that could, if properly presented, shift the weight of the jury's perception. Combined with Melody's evasive answers, her erased browser history, her proximity to the crime scene, and her failure to report Gary missing, it now formed a web too thick to ignore. In preparation for trial, the DA's team began constructing the narrative not around speculation, but around behavior. Motive would come from control and financial dependency, opportunity from isolation and access. The crime scene, forensic residue, and post-crime actions would become the prosecution's core timeline. From the moment of the gunshot to the burning, to the clean tools, and the digital trail of legal inquiries and erased drafts. Melody's defense team offered no alternative suspect, no alibi, no emotional argument for her innocence. Instead, they leaned into ambiguity. No murder weapon, no eyewitness, and no surveillance video of the act. They portrayed her as a woman trapped in grief and poor memory, perhaps erratic in her actions, but not homicidal. Jury selection was quiet, meticulous. The trial itself unfolded with slow intensity. Forensic experts detailed the heat distribution in the fire pit. The blood pattern analyst explained the trajectory of the bullet based on the cracked rib. A digital forensics specialist mapped the erased browser history, showing time-stamped entries just days before Gary's death, querying legal questions about power of attorney and inheritance thresholds. But the moment the courtroom turned came unexpectedly, when Melody, against her legal team's advice, decided to speak. She took the stand in her own defense calmly, without emotion. She denied involvement as expected. But then, under cross-examination, the prosecution asked a direct question. "Did you ever tell anyone, after Gary went missing, that it's done, there's nothing to fix now?" She paused, tilted her head slightly, then said, "Yes, I did say that. But I wasn't talking about Gary's death. The courtroom hushed. The jury leaned in. What were you referring to, Mrs. Ferris? And then for the first time in the entire investigation, Melody shifted blame. She said she had discovered Gary's body, already lifeless, in the garage, that she had panicked, that her son Scott had been involved in an argument with Gary days earlier, and that perhaps, just perhaps, he had returned. She couldn't be sure, but she wasn't responsible, she insisted. She was only left with the aftermath. The accusation landed like a bombshell. Scott, seated in the gallery, looked stunned. His name had never appeared in any criminal analysis, nor in forensic results. He had no gunpowder residue, no motive, no digital ties to the scene during the window of time when the homicide occurred. The implication was hollow and transparent. But now, the defense had introduced reasonable doubt, or at least attempted to. The prosecution responded swiftly. They reintroduced Scott's interview, his cooperation, and the forensic timeline that conclusively showed no contact with the property during the period in question. They replayed the call Melody had made to a financial advisor just hours after Gary's disappearance, asking about insurance. They showed the unrecovered gun's caliber matching residue in her own garage. They emphasized, if her story were true, why didn't she report it then? And most of all, why try to erase everything? The jury deliberated for less than a day. Melody Ferris was found guilty of malice murder, concealing the death of another, and tampering with evidence. The court sentenced her to life in prison, with the possibility of parole only after 30 years. She showed no reaction, no tears, no anger. Just the same detachment she had carried through the investigation. The same stillness that, from the beginning, had told investigators what her words never did. After the verdict, the courtroom emptied without applause. There were no cheers, no emotional outbursts, just the quiet sound of chairs scraping against linoleum, footsteps on polished tile, and a few whispered words between attorneys closing their files. The trial had ended, but the reverberations of the crime were only beginning to settle across the lives it had fractured. For Scott Ferris, the son who had grown up believing in structure, in family, in some form of emotional order, the betrayal was more than legal. His mother hadn't just taken someone's life, she had tried to take his name down with her. In her final moments before sentencing, she hadn't apologized. She hadn't looked at him. Her last words on the record were not a denial, but a redirection. For him, that wasn't just avoidance, it was erasure. In the weeks that followed the sentencing, Scott formally changed his last name. He stopped answering interview requests, sold his truck, and left Georgia altogether. To neighbors, his departure wasn't dramatic. He didn't leave notes, didn't burn bridges. He simply disappeared in the way only someone truly wounded can, quietly, completely, and without the desire to ever explain himself again. Back in Cherokee County, the Ferris property was sold at auction. The house stood empty for months. Fire pit still marked in yellow paint, garage floor cracked, windows boarded by a real estate company with no interest in the home's history. No one in the area rushed to buy it. For a long time, even the curious stayed away. It had become the kind of house people looked at from a distance, then turned away from, unwilling to acknowledge the kind of violence that could exist inside four clean walls and under a well-manicured lawn. Gary Ferris's former law office remained open for a short time under interim leadership until the staff disbanded. His clients were referred elsewhere. His name was removed from the front door. No memorial was ever held. His closest colleagues admitted they didn't know how to talk about what happened. Some expressed guilt, wondering if they'd missed the signs. Others felt rage, not just for the murder, but for how thoroughly it had been disguised behind years of silence. The investigators, though seasoned, carried the case with them differently, not because of the forensics or the difficulty of conviction, but because of the quietness. There was no explosion, no cry for help, no frantic phone call, just a man who vanished, a fire that smoldered in the dark, and a woman who watched it burn. One of the lead detectives later remarked in an internal report that the case taught him not to wait for noise. Sometimes, he wrote, what doesn't happen is the clearest signal we'll ever get. That insight became the legacy of the Ferris case. This wasn't a story about a sudden act of violence. It was about slow erosion, a relationship that calcified over years into something unrecognizable, a quiet shift from emotional distance to irreversible action, and above all, a reminder that not every killer yells and not every victim sees it coming. In the end, Gary didn't leave a trail of words or warnings, but he left behind something stronger: patterns, details, choices. The systems he believed in, the law, the courts, the evidence, were the very structures that ultimately spoke for him. And though Melody Ferris said little throughout the entire process, her silence told a story of its own. A story of denial, of detachment, and of the kind of emotional vacancy that doesn't scream, but whispers just enough for the right people to hear it. The Ferris case closed without ceremony, but what remained in its wake was a question far more difficult than guilt or innocence. How many tragedies live undetected in the spaces where we assume there is peace? That's the story that outlived the verdict. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.